Okay, welcome to the first video of paper 3. This is Weimar and Nazi Germany 1918 to 1939, and this video is going to talk through key topic 1, which is the Weimar Republic, looking at the years 1918 in it with its inception through to 1919 through to 1929 with the gradual collapse of democracy in Germany and the rise of the Nazis and Hitler. Starting off, the context really is looking at the First World War. Obviously, breaks out in August 1914, and Germany is fighting a war on two fronts. By 1917, Russia had withdrawn because of the Russian Revolution, and all of Germany's forces were centered on the Western Front, fighting the British and the French as well. Throughout the whole entirety of the war, German ports had been blockaded by the Royal Navy. So by 1918, the German command had decided to throw one final throw of the dice. The United States had joined the war in 1917 as well, but with Russia's exit into the war, they thought this was the chance to kind of make that final breakthrough. In the spring of 1918, they do this in a huge offensive where they actually get very close to Paris, and it does seem as if the war is going to end. But because of the blockades of German cities, supplies weren't getting through to the men at the front, and general exhaustion meant that the Allies were able to push the Germans back, all the way back, and that's where we get the Armistice and the surrender at the end of the First World War as well. So on the 11th of November 1918, the Germans agree to surrender, and they meet the Allied delegates in a train carriage, and this is where they surrender as well. The Kaiser on the 9th of November, had decided to abdicate, and he'd stepped down. So a provisional government was put in place, and these are the people that are going to sign the armistice and sign the surrender, who then will notoriously be referred to as the November criminals by the far right as well. That they signed, and this is where we're going to start to see the stab in the back myth as well develop. The fact that the German army never lost the war. The Allies never stepped foot on German soil. It was the left-wing politicians back in Germany and the Jews who led to the surrender as well. Nevertheless, Germany will go through a huge transition here, obviously, going from having a monarchy, even though it was what we call a constitutional monarchy, where you have a monarch and a parliament. So they did have the Reichstag beforehand, the German parliament, and the Kaiser, the monarch. They're going to go through a transition from November through to January as well. And this is that period of time we call the provisional government as well. The Weimar Republic will officially be proclaimed in January of 1919, and the elections will take place in January of 1919. In February, those elections will be ratified, and that's where we'll see the first government of the Weimar Republic put in place. But before that even happens in January, in Berlin, there is street fighting. For this is the opportunity that the communists, the KPD, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, take the opportunity to attempt to seize power in Berlin after the end of the First World War. There is vicious street fighting, but the leader of the provisional government, Friedrich Ebert, who will become the president of the new republic, has already signed an agreement with the army called the Ebert-Groener Agreement, which meant the army would be used to put down any resistance to the new republic, and this was predominantly aimed at the communists, who were seen as a huge threat. Obviously, 2 years prior to this, there had been a revolution in Russia. One of the largest land empires in the world had collapsed. The Tsar had been murdered with his family, and Russia was now communist. So people feared this communism. But the army is sent in, the Freikorps are sent in, and they brutally put down the Spartacist uprising, as it's called, within a few days, at the death of a couple of hundred, including Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. But what we also see is we see issues from the far right as well. On the right-hand side, we see the issues of the Kapp Putsch, which happened a year later in March of 1920. But again, it just shows that early on, the Republic was under severe threat from extremists on the left and on the right as well. The problem with the Kapp Putsch was that Ebert again tried to use the army based on that agreement. The Freikorps though refused, and government buildings were seized during the Kapp Putsch by Wolfgang Kapp and General Luttwitz of the German army. It's only general strikes across the city of Berlin which actually prevent that. It just shows you that very early on the Republic was on shaky foundations. Those first elections are really significant. And what we actually see is a huge turnout. 83% of the German people turn out. The new guidelines of this new constitution is that we have universal suffrage. So the fact that all women and men over the age of 20 could vote, and that's in Article 22 as well. The authority came from the people, that's Article 1. So we see that a democracy has developed, and 83% turnout shows us that people wanted this change. They wanted democracy. 78% of that 83 voted for pro-democratic parties as well. And the largest party came out of those elections was the Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, with 39%. Now, they did not get the majority there, and we have the Centre Party down there, 17%, and they would be involved in every single Weimar government. This is where we start to see the use of coalitions. Now, coalition governments are formed when a majority cannot be found, and it is because the German system of elections was through proportional representation. So the amount of seats, the percentage of the seats you got equated to how many seats you got in the Reichstag as well. And whilst proportional representation is extremely democratic, it also means that there's splintering in parties and there's fragmentation. I always imagine the Reichstag being like a grenade, and little fragments are all over the Reichstag, and that's what you get here. So you have to have coalition governments. And often in Weimar Germany, coalitions were formed of 3 or more parties. And the first very coalition government is formed of 3 parties, and it doesn't last a year. They were meant to last 4 years, and in the end, there are 13 coalition governments in 11 years. There's no stability when it comes to this as well. The structure of this new democracy is also really significant as well. And the constitution at the time was seen as very radical. There was nothing seen of its kind in the world at the time. Giving men and women the vote, particularly women, was unheard of, and some of the other rights as well, especially to ethnic minorities. In Article 113, minorities had the same legal rights as anyone else too, and Article 109 also gave everyone freedom, the same rights, so that gave women the rights as well. So whilst on the one hand it was a very modern democracy, with proportional representation and with those articles as mentioned, the constitution also potentially sowed the seeds of its own destruction, as it kept many of the systems that were also in place previously in Imperial Germany with the Kaiser as well. So one of those was Article 48. Now, whilst this was a new feature of the constitution, it was similar to the powers that the Kaiser had in Imperial Germany. So they could suspend the constitution if they so wished, and they could dismiss the chancellor if they so wished, and this was limitless. And this would be a problem later in the Weimar years with the excessive use of Article 48. The army also maintained a lot of its influence that it had during Imperial Germany as well. And whilst the president was the commander-in-chief of the army were very right-wing, they weren't democratic, and they were going to cause major problems, and we already mentioned that with the Kapp Putsch as well. The chancellor didn't have as much power as they probably should have, even though they meant to be the elected person who was in charge of running government. It's the president that has the most power, and again, that could cause problems there too. Another major problem is the retention of some of the traditional forces, as we call them. So we've already talked about the army, but things like the judiciary, so the judges, who were quite right-wing, quite conservative, and were anti-democratic, and also the civil service, so the people who work within government, many of them were also quite conservative as well. So we have 2 sides of the argument here. The Republic was very democratic. It was very modern compared to other democracies at the time, and definitely including Britain, but it also had some of those elements of conservatism, meaning that it had problems. Now, obviously, the first issue that the Republic has to deal with, major issue, is surrendering at the end of the First World War, and then they have to deal with the uprisings from the extreme left and extreme right. But its major problem is in June of 1919, when it has to sign the Versailles Treaty. Now, because they'd lost the war, Germany were anticipating having to pay some sort of reparations and accept some sort of blame, but I don't think they expected what the terms of the Versailles Treaty actually were. I don't think they expected that. Versailles is the palace outside of Paris, and this is where they all meet in June of 1919. The German delegation are not involved in the discussions. This is mainly dominated by the British under David Lloyd George, the Americans under Woodrow Wilson, and the French under George Clemenceau. Now, the French are pushing for harsh terms placed on Germany. Germany had invaded France in 1870. Germany had invaded France in 1914. They wanted to remove any chance that Germany could invade France ever again. So they were pushing for these really, really harsh restrictions. And in the end, because most of the war had taken place in France, the British and the Americans side with Clemenceau. So the most important feature of this treaty is Article 231. This is the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to accept full responsibility for causing the First World War. Now, this isn't true, but they had to sign it and agree to it. They obviously called this treaty a diktat, a dictated peace, because they had no choice. If they didn't sign the treaty, a renewal of hostilities would take place. The French and the British and the Americans would invade Germany, and they were in no position to repel that invasion. So they had essentially no choice. People back in Germany, seeing the news of the Versailles Treaty, didn't see it that way. Particularly the right wing and people like Adolf Hitler and the Nazis see it as an abomination, but ultimately the government had no choice. So within that guilt clause, they then have to accept that their army is reduced to 100,000. They would have no navy. They would have no air force. They had to pay 6.6 billion in the sums of reparations that were going to be set up. They would have 2 years to start paying the reparations after the treaty was signed. We know that they can't afford it. They would lose lots of land in Europe, and they would lose all of their overseas colonies. 13% of land in Germany was lost to other European powers. We know that they have to lose land to Poland, shown by the Polish corridor. They lose the Saarland to France, where the coal fields were. They lose areas to Denmark and Belgium, and obviously Czechoslovakia as well. So 13% of its land and about 12% of its population. So think about how the impact of that economically as well. All that taxable income is not going to be used for Germany. All those raw materials are no longer Germany as well. Alongside that, the Rhineland had to be demilitarized. They weren't allowed any soldiers in this region here as well. So they were also vulnerable to attack. And finally, they were excluded from the new League of Nations that was set up. So that new group organization designed to avoid conflict and obviously protection. Germany is not a part of the League of Nations, meaning again, it is vulnerable. So we call this time period 1918 to 1923 the crisis years, but 1923 is the crisis year. So having already had to surrender in 1918, already having to deal with uprisings from the Spartacists and the Cat Putsch, amongst others as well, during those early years, then having to deal with the Versailles Treaty, we then see 1923 come along. In December of 1922, the German government fails to pay the reparations that it owes to France, and this was in the form of coal. As a result of that, the French believe that they have gone against the agreement of the Versailles Treaty, and the only rational response is to invade. So 750,000 French and Belgian troops march into the Ruhr region, the industrial heartland of Germany, and they seize all of the factories. Now, the German government at this point announces passive resistance. They announce to the workers, we will keep paying you, but don't work and refuse to work. And this only exacerbates the situation. Inflation in Germany had already been increasing before this period. So during the war as well, in 1919, inflation was increasing. The strength of the German Reichsmark was weak compared to other currencies as well. And you can see from the table here how that just increases even further. So by November of 1923, a loaf of bread is costing somewhere in the region of 480 billion Reichsmarks, and people are having to print money, and this is where we get hyperinflation as well. So it's got long-term causes. It's got obviously the hangover of the First World War, so all the loss during the war economy. It's also got the issues of the Versailles Treaty. The reparation payments are far too much to pay. They're unrealistic. Germany has lost a lot of its economic income. It's lost a lot of its raw materials. They're printing more money anyway. As a response, they then announce passive resistance. The French invade, and it all comes to a head really as well. So it's no surprise that in November of 1923 is the month that Adolf Hitler attempts to seize power in Munich. There's also another communist uprising in Hamburg as well. When the economy is struggling, that's when we see extremism and attempts to remove the government as well. But Gustav Stresemann becomes the Chancellor in August of 1923. So whilst hyperinflation is obviously spiraling out of control, and in his first 100 days in office, he makes huge sways to recovery. So whilst November is the peak of hyperinflation, the zenith, if you will, Stresemann had already things in the woodwork trying to actually improve the situation as well. Well, the first things that he does is he sets up a brand new bank called the Reich Bank, and a brand new currency is going to be introduced, and that's called the Rentenmark as well. So the old Reichmark would be, they would get rid of it, and the brand new currency would help to reduce that idea of inflation as well, and it stabilized that as well. And it also gave people confidence in foreign investors as well. As we know, hyperinflation had massively damaged the middle class. So the middle class has lost their savings as well, and their pensions and insurance. So what they needed was a really strong response, and the Rentenmark helps to kind of abate some of those issues there as well. He also sets up the Dawes Plan. So that's the plan with the United States. In 1924, Germany would borrow from American banks with a strong currency. They would be able to pay back some of the reparations that they owed to the British and the French, but at a reduced rate, more reasonable, more payable over time. And they also had the ability to inject more money into the German economy as well. By 1928, unemployment has reduced. It never went below 1.3 million, but German exports are on the increase again. The standard of living is starting to increase. Food is more widely available, and heavy industry also starts to develop as well. And we know this is that era that we call the golden years, with the economic recovery during this time as well. Obviously, the Dawes Plan is superficial in the end, and it's not sustainable. It is all reliant on the United States and in the US economy being strong. And we know that in 1929, we see the Wall Street crash, which means the Dawes Plan doesn't work in the end as well. And Stresemann himself said that they were dancing on a volcano. Furthermore, he also introduces, before the Wall Street crash in 1929, the Young Plan, which actually reduced the reparation payment from 6.6 billion to 2 billion. So that's a reduction of around 3/4, which is a huge reduction. The right wing still opposed this. People like Hitler still opposed it because they still claimed we shouldn't be paying them anyway. But again, I don't think you can question the ability that Stresemann had here to get a good deal, and he was an excellent negotiator as well. So that also put the reparation payments lower over a longer period of time, and they would have paid them off by 1988. So the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan are two hugely significant deals that Stresemann makes to improve Germany's economic situation, alongside the Rentenmark as well. He also convinces the French to leave the Ruhr, which they do by 1930. Again, so the Ruhr could become the economic powerhouse that it was as well there too. He also, other than economically, he only serves a few months as Chancellor, and it's as Foreign Minister that he becomes most significant, and he's able to sign a series of treaties as well. So in 1925, he signs the Locarno Treaty with members of Europe, particularly France and some of his Eastern European neighbours like Czechoslovakia. And whilst this treaty didn't give Germany back any land, it reaffirmed those borders, and it increased that kind of that mutual respect and better relations. So Franco-German relations improved as a result. 2 years prior, in 1923, they'd been at rock bottom when the French had obviously invaded. So this was really important as well. In 1926, probably his greatest achievement, he is able to get Germany into the League of Nations. He actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for this accolade. And again, Germany were now being respected and internationally accepted after obviously what had happened after the Versailles Treaty and after the First World War. And in 1928, he also is able to get Germany into the Kellogg-Briand Pact again. This is 61 of the countries, including the United States, agree to not use force. So again, it's just this idea of increasing Germany's international prestige and reputation, and then being accepted into the international community as well. I did say that living standard improved. 3 million houses were built during Stresemann's time, and also an unemployment law was passed, so an insurance law. So those who were unemployed were also able to get welfare. And we know that the Weimar Republic dedicated a lot of its money to welfare payments as well. The other key thing, obviously, just to mention regarding the golden years is the appointment of Hindenburg there as president. In 1925, Frederick Ebert, the president of the Weimar Republic, dies of a heart attack, and there was a presidential election. And Paul von Hindenburg, who was the hero of the First World War, German military hero, but a Prussian aristocrat, he actually is convinced to go for the presidency, and he wins it. Now, he is anti-democratic, but the key thing with Hindenburg's election as president is that Hindenburg refused to betray his position. He believed that he had a duty to protect Germany, so he would not betray his position as president, but he would not support democracy either. So Hindenburg creates that medium where he appeases the right wing who saw one of their own in power and in politics, but also appeased the left wing because they knew that he would not betray democracy at the same time as well. So the final part then is to kind of look obviously at the changing status of women and also that of culture as well and society. So we mentioned at the start of the video, Article 109 gave women equal rights. So marriage was an equal partnership. Women were should have been able to enter professions on an equal basis with men. They could stand for election, they could vote. So from that point of view, there was an extreme amount of progress made for women during Weimar Germany, particularly regarding women's rights. Were those rights always fulfilled? Not always. Did we see disparity between the amount of women in work compared to men? Yes, we did. The amount of women in work actually reduced from 1918, 75% down to 36% in 1925 as well. A lot of the time they were paid 33% less than men. So we did see those conservative attitudes still remain, but again, from a progress point of view, women did technically have those rights as well. And we see huge social change for women as well. We see the development of the new woman as well. Women start to become hugely important in kind of social change. We see women in culture. Just on the left there is the comic duo of Bebby and Lily. You can see that they're wearing makeup, they have their hair short, they're technically wearing men's clothing at the time, and we see that being really popular as well. So the new woman kind of encapsulates the culture of Weimar and women. You know, they would drink, smoke, they would go out, they would be sexually liberated, financially independent. We see that as well. And the birth rate actually started to decrease during the 1920s, and the divorce rate actually increased as well, something that the Nazis would obviously make sure they changed when they got into power. And then looking at from a kind of cultural point of view as well, so the Weimar Republic it endorses liberal thinking and progressiveness. So we start to see German cinema become at the forefront of world cinema during the 1920s as well. So we see the creation of new genres for the first time. Prior to the First World War, films had been quite romantic, and after the First World War, after some of the horrors that some of the people saw, we start to see a darker spin on some of the films as well. So we see Nosferatu on the right there, you know, the first vampiric film. We see the very first horror film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, a hypnotist who hypnotizes someone who actually murders people, you know, really quite dark. But we also see really modern films as well. And on the left, we see the masterpiece that is Metropolis by Fritz Lang, which we can see is extremely modern and way, way ahead of its time there as well. But we also in artwork as well, we see new types of artwork. So we see modernism, we see expressionism, we see the new objectivism as well, showing society as it really is, not romanticizing it. And we see artists like Otto Dix, who had served in the trenches, and he paints a really horrific painting called Gas Mask to show the kind of horrors of the First World War as well. We also see architecture obviously develop as well, and we see the Bauhaus movement. So Walter Gropius developed the movement, which was an architectural movement, and it was really ahead of its time. And architecture was very different. Architecture became quite functional. It was all about using shapes like triangles and squares. It was so radical in 1925 that they actually closed the school down. It reopens in 1930. But it kind of just gives you a sense of the differences in culture in Weimar Germany as well. So that is the end of key topic 1. Tune in next time for key topic 2, which looks at the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler.